be loud when I want to, okay? So thank you for being here and for this class. I don't need to introduce Damon, I'm not going to do that, but I do have a big announcement. It's about next week through March. Because of the arrangement of this class, we didn't realize there was going to be this many people. The arrangement of this class and our commitment also as a class to this hallway through January was to provide snacks for this hallway. But starting next week, the class is going to be in the choir room, okay? It's going to be in the choir room starting next week, so be aware of that. Here's a couple of things that are important to realize. Communication, conversation is better there in the choir room because there's no break in the middle like this here. So you can hear all the way across it. That's good. It only holds maybe 5 to 10 more people, so it's not that it's a lot larger, but it's all open to be able to hear. This is what you need to know. You cannot enter the choir room by going through the stage. You have to enter it from one of the outside doors, okay? You have to enter it from one of the outside doors. The south parking lot, those outside doors are near that south parking lot. So if you go to first service, if it's raining, you have to go out and go through one of those doors into the choir room. We'll be starting to use that next week and through Damon's class, which will probably be through the end of March. Is that right? And if we can get him to extend it to April, we will. We're going to start with a prayer. Jacob's going to lead us in a prayer, and then we're going to get started with James after that.
Let's pray. Father, we just thank you for a day that we all come together to pause and to bring all that we are and all that we have before you. I ask that you will help us to do that every day of the week, that every day will resemble what was happening in the first century when your spirit just caught like wildfire and tore down barriers between people, like we see you doing when you came to this earth, whether it was a woman at the well whose religion, ethnicity, sexual ethic, etc., gender were barriers, what should have been in that culture in that time. You tore those down. You said, I'm going to see the image of God within you. I'm going to see the inherent value within you because you are a child of God. So God, I ask that you will help us to take that posture outside of these walls as well, but that within these walls there will be walls between us. That we can learn how to reflect the diversity and the unity that's present between Father, Son, and Spirit. That we can come to look more and more like your Son, reflecting your glory as we're transformed by your Spirit. Because we know that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. So God, we ask that you will just use us to promote freedom. You will use us to promote your purpose, your kingdom, here where we are every day. Thank you again for Damon's vulnerability to stand before this group of people and to lead a discussion that is not an easy discussion to have, but one that is incredibly valuable to have. Thank you for the open dialogue that this place is having, the willingness for the leadership, the willingness for those in this room to engage in tough topics. And God, we know that you are present, you are here, and we know that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So we know that you're here with us, and that's present here. So thank you for what you give us. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for your Son. Thank you for your Spirit. It's in his name we pray.
Good morning. Good morning. I don't know what that was that just came on. What is that, air or is that heat?
Heat, turn it on. Sorry.
If it's the heat, for once I'm going to actually be in trouble. I wore my Long John shirt. So I appreciate you being here today. Let's go ahead and get started. And today, I really want us to spend some time kind of processing our conversation from last week. I think it's really important that we go back there because, really understanding what we talked about last week, I think is the beginning of understanding on a much larger scale. And so I've written some things on the board as just reminders, and I know everybody can't see them, so I'll just tell you what's there. I've written Genesis 1 again so that we remember that the context that we go back to when we get to a place of difficulty, when we get to a place of disagreement, is Genesis 1, 26, 27. We are made in the image and likeness of God. And so we have to go back there because it is the one thing that regardless of what your cultural background, regardless of your race, regardless of your ethnicity, it is the one thing that's true of all of us. So we have to go back there. I also wrote our objectives, and I just kind of abbreviated them because it's really important that this be a space where we can have a conversation. And so today, I'm not going to do all the talking. I don't think I ever have, but for sure today I'm not going to. And I want us to have the conversation for the reason, the second objective, so that when we find ourselves in those spaces where this conversation needs to be had, we feel confident that we can have this conversation with people around whatever issue it might be, not having all the answers, but again, having the knowledge that we are all made in His image. I also wrote up there the word privilege, because that's kind of where we left off last week. And I wrote a much shorter definition than we talked about last week. And so just think about, this unearned advantage that's conferred systematically. It's not something that you work for. It's not something that you just get it because of who you are. And then, I don't know what I wrote at the very bottom. Oh, and then I talked about normalized culture. And I talked about how, especially in America, there is a standard. There are, in our minds, there are lots of different cultures. But in America, there's a very normalized culture too. And that normalized culture is a white culture. It is evident in how we approach history. And I think I told you that last week. There's history, and if I said to you we're going to have a history class, most of you would think the same thing. And so in order to get the full picture, we have to also have a African American history class and an Asian American history class, because the normalized culture is just history. When we go into a grocery store, if we walk down the aisle where the hair products are, it's very clear that the normalized culture is not anyone who's not Caucasian. So, my mother and my wife, they have to pick up and read because there's not a lot there for different ethnic groups, different races, different cultures for their hair. There's just not a lot there. So they have to kind of figure out, okay, do I get it here or do I go to one of those little shops, Sally's Beauty Salon or whatever, and get it there?
They have an ethnicity section now.
You would know.
He doesn't have to worry about those hair products.
Thank you, Paulette.
It's been a while since you've been down the aisle.
Yes, and she's right. It is there. It is there. So there's, again, the normalized culture, which is kind of the standard. And then I wrote down some words up at the top of the board that we've talked about, because I'm going to open it up here in a minute, and I want to kind of hear, what did you process over the week that just ended? What did you kind of struggle with? What do you want to push back on? And I think that's really important. I wrote down a quote, and I cannot believe I didn't write it all down. And it's just, political correctness makes us miss the opportunity to learn humbly from moments. And I know there's more to the quote, but I didn't write it down. So I want us to just kind of rest there. This is not about being politically correct. It is about being decent. It is about being respectful, but it's not about being politically correct. And if we don't have these conversations, we never further our relationships. We never get anywhere. We just kind of stay on the surface. And so I really want us to be able to have conversations about that. So I wrote down some words that we've talked about. Probably of all of the phrases up there, the one that I would say we most talked about is cultural identity. Who am I, and why am I here? How did I get to this place? And we've talked about, culture is defined by so many different things. It's defined by our history, so we have very little impact over that. You know, you're in a family and your family has some story. Terry Smith would probably give me a high five right now. You know, we have no control over that. It's your story. The question is, then what do you do with your story? But more than that, it also is about then just your life and how you interpret things that happen in your life. You know, some of us were born and we had two parents, and those two parents loved us, and blah, blah, blah. Some of us have parents that got divorced. How do we interpret that? Some of us have parents that died early. How do we interpret that? So all of that affects my cultural identity, and it makes me respond to people very differently. What I have to be careful about is when I'm responding to people, making sure that my privilege doesn't disadvantage their identity. I have to really think about that. Make sure that what I have that makes me who I am, my own privilege, doesn't disadvantage them. And so give me an example, David. I have to make sure that when I'm working with kids who don't have school supplies or kids who are homeless, I have to make sure that I don't say things like, this is kind of not going to tie, but you'll get it. You know, your parents just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I can't say things like, well, my mother and dad always got me school supplies, because that's my privilege. We weren't wealthy by American standards, but my mother was a supervisor at Levi Strauss for years. My mother worked at the United States Post Office for 20 years. My dad was a foreman at a construction job. So I can't let my privilege disadvantage others. I've got to find ways to rein that in. Some of you have seen me do this. That's what I'm doing when I do that. I do that to everybody at work. It's like, okay, stop.
Or when I'm in pain, you go.
Yeah, when she's in pain and getting ready to cry, oh Lord, no. That ain't gonna help nobody. So that's what that's about, and I apologize. So, in just a minute, I'm gonna have to do another activity. So while I'm now gonna tell one story, and then allow you to talk about what you heard and what you processed over the week. Those of you who don't have a pencil or a pen, Tom, go ahead and be getting one out. Borrow one, do whatever you have to do, because you probably will need it. You may not. You could use your phone too, I'm sure. So, you probably have heard people say, you know, the struggle is real. And, you know, Dr. Joseph, one of the things he says is, state your truth. And it's like, okay, I'm going to state my truth. And you hear people say that, and you probably think, what are they saying? Well, maybe you don't think, what are they saying? I thought, what are they saying? But, you know, part of the reason why this conversation is so important, I think, is because, man, we all have stories. And, you know, those stories are real for us. I remember a couple of months ago, I was riding to a retreat with a friend of mine, and he was long gas, and we were out in the middle of somewhere in Tennessee, I don't remember where, and you know, he's kind of one of those friends that's kind of way out there. He's kind of loud, and he's kind of everything. He's just kind of, and I'm just not that person, believe it or not. I'm kind of, you know, low-key. Everybody doesn't have to know that I'm in the room. And he whips his truck off of the main highway, and he goes down some back street to get gas. And this is like a little country town. And I said to him, I said, why are you taking me to get gas here? And he's like, well, what's the problem? I said, I won't say his name. Tommy.
Not me.
I said, Tommy, black folks don't go to places like this to get gas. And he looked at me and he said to me since, I thought you were joking. And I was like, I'm not joking with you. Black folks don't go to places like this to get gas. We get gas on the main drag. And if we can't get it on the main drag, then we just run out and call AAA. Because, there are some places that we just don't want to go. A couple of, well, everything was a couple of months ago. Maybe it was last Christmas. The Kathy convoy was traveling back from the beach. I don't remember who was driving. But one of us made the mistake of exiting in Cummins, Georgia. I don't know if you know the history of Cummins, Georgia. But Cummins, Georgia had a racial cleansing in 1912. They ran all the black people out of town. And in 1987, when Oprah went down, because she's Oprah, they almost ran her out of town. And so we all pulled off the highway in Cummins, Georgia, and all of a sudden phones are ringing. It's like, who is calling? It's my oldest brother. It's my oldest brother. God love him. That's his wife. He said, do you know where we are? And I'm like, yeah, we're in Georgia. He said, this is Cummins, Georgia. Get back on the interstate now. So all of us took our cars. We couldn't find anywhere to turn around. We went all up into town, turned around, and got back on the interstate. Because black folks don't pull off the interstate too much in Cummins, Georgia. Because Cummins, Georgia has a history that is frightening. Because even in 1987, after Oprah went there, this whole idea of racial cleansing has been an ongoing conversation in Cummins, Georgia. We just don't go there. Now, that may shock you. I don't know, maybe it doesn't. But a lot of times that's the reality of people who are not a part of the normalized culture. It may seem like just get over it. It may seem like but slavery was so long ago, move forward. But the reality is, it's still very much a reality in our country. And I want to be clear that I'm saying to you, people who are not a part of the normalized culture, it's more than a black-white thing. That's why the conversation is so important. Because in order for us to get to a better place, we have to be willing to explore each other's truth. So what did you hear last week? What were you challenged by?
David, I was challenged by that statement, what you said just now about getting off in Cummings, Georgia. Because the way I would interpret that as a white male is if I went to, and I'm going to use the term generically, the projects, and I got gas, and I got shot, well, what was that white boy doing in the projects? And it would not faze me to go to the projects to get gas. It might faze my wife, and she'd say, you're crazy. Well, it just doesn't bother me. Should it? Maybe it should. But I would challenge you back about the Cummings, Georgia thing, because I know your family, I love your family. If 5 cars got off at Cummings, Georgia, and stopped and got gas, well, I'd have respect for you that you were willing to go there and do that. Does that make sense?
Can I not reply?
Yes. That's fair. That's fair.
I'll come back.
There's a classic scene, just a little humor.
Speak up just a little bit.
There's a classic scene, and Cal and I joke about it a lot in National Lampoon's Family Vacation, where they're going through St. Louis. I think they may have, I don't know where they were at the time, but they get off the interstate. Don't worry, Helen, fine. And they're like, Clark, where are we? And they're surrounded by black people. And they're like, oh, it's great. We don't need to turn our backs toward the plight of the cities. in, say, the cities and he said, it's okay. So we're going through and the windows are all rolled down. They're all looking around. You hear 2 shots, roll them up, and they get back out. So anyway, I don't know how we interpret that. It's just, that's American culture. Maybe that's
Well, they were in East St. Louis, because I'm from St. Louis, and that's East St. Louis. You just keep rolling. Keep rolling. Okay, I'm sorry.
Tom?
I think it's important that we remember as a group that we don't live in the projects. And it's different, and the only reason I know this is because I had a black partner for 4.5 years. And I worked in the projects for 8. And we don't live, if you don't like the projects, you can go home. Damon can't stop being black. He's gonna walk out of here the same color today as he was yesterday. And it's a difference that I didn't understand until I was with somebody who was black 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and listening to people around us. See, when I stepped back and he was on the other side of the room, it's a different conversation. And so, yes, you stopping in the projects, you would have no problem with that, but you get to leave. And it's hard. I can't understand it. I mean, I worked there and lived in that community for weeks on end, and I still don't think I have a full grasp on how it can affect you when you live it every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You don't get to leave. And so when we say these things and they're a little funny, it's almost heartbreaking. You know, to have that toe in the water and feel it just a little bit, I can't imagine. I mean, I really get sad at those instances. I wish we had a community where we lived together all the time and got to feel each other's community all the time and learn from each other's histories all the time, but we don't. We don't do that. And there's no way we can relate. There's no way.
I appreciate what you said last week about how when people say I don't see color with good intentions, they are explaining to you that they just don't get it because they can step away, and only people who can step away say that. I had always hated that phrase because to me it felt like you're disrespecting someone's culture and the fact that they are different than you, and you're trying to put everyone in one pot, which just doesn't work because we are different. We've grown up in different races and different ethnicities and houses, and when we say I don't see color, there's that intention of I'm trying to say that I don't walk into a room and immediately analyze what race the people are in the room, and sure, that's a good thing to do, yet at the same time, we also want to respect the fact that skin color does identify us with certain cultural realities, and it does identify us in certain ways that our society has placed us in positions where the normalized culture is mainstream and everything else is not. So I appreciated what you said. It gave me a different perspective to think about the fact that when you are a person of color, you can't just walk away from being in that category.
Yes.
Yeah, and I would just say, going off of that concept, I had a friend one time who told me, a Latina, a female, said, and being a fully legal member of society, said, you may be able to, like my mom will not go into a store again if there's an issue that happens, or something like that. Like, let's say maybe they're overcharged for something or they get the wrong item. It's like she walks into a space and she fully realizes the way that eyes are on her as a Latina in our context, and I was floored. It's So I'm like, I just walk into the room, my chest can be puffed out, I own it, I go where I need to go, I get what I need to get. Someone makes a mistake, I make it known, I come back in and try to get things set straight. But, you know, so if I'm, the feeling that one may get, right, if I were to stop off and get gas, maybe in an area within the multicultural community and feel kind of out of place, it's like, that's how my friend's mom feels every day, anywhere she goes. And so she says she tries to be as invisible as possible because of how unwelcome or how strange she feels going into different places, even into a grocery store or into a TJ Maxx. Like, I won't go back in there. I won't make a fuss, I won't make a noise because of kind of the way she cannot separate from her demographic factors, right? Being like the fact that I have an ethnicity, right? But my hair products aren't in an ethnicity section in the store. You know, it's like it's really interesting how that's something that can't be separated from, that people always carry with them, and that I never have to think about because I'm a Caucasian male, a very large part of normalized culture. So I can walk around and not have to think about the fact that I'm a white male. But this Latina woman is not ever not thinking about the fact that she is Hispanic, she's a female. It's really interesting.
With that said, I like to point out something real quick. I know multiple different people from multiple different race and cultures. I know a family that one of my friends is from a family that is from multiple race. His mom is white and his dad is black. And he has, 5 sisters and 4 other brothers. And they're all married multiple different race of people from different race. And one of them is married to a Hispanic woman, one's married to, just multiple different races. And I go there and they cook food for me without me asking them to do it. And then I know multiple race of friends. And to me, I don't see color. I see friendship that I can try to make. And if I can build a friendship with different people, I can minister to that person. Or I can just be there for that person. So I don't know.
There was one over here. Yes. I don't know who it was.
I was gonna ask, is there anything but a normalized culture? Because wherever we might go in this country that they don't look like me, they're gonna have their normalized culture. Or, I may go somewhere where it's a purely Hispanic community. That's a normalized culture. Right? I mean, normalized is whatever's predominant in the area historically, I suppose. Not necessarily right, wrong, or whatever, it's just what it is.
Is it relative? That's the question. Is normalized culture
Yes.
relative? Or is it just one, and that's what it is?
I think that's a good point.
Speak up, 'cause
I just said, I think that's a good point, because I think there are differences depending on where you are in the United States or anywhere else in the world. For example, that, like you were talking about, Cummins, Georgia, where, it was normal to, not like people of other races for whatever reason. But, here, I don't think we have as much of that. Maybe I'm wrong.
When we say I don't see color, especially white folks, when white folks say that, I think we're just fooling ourselves. I don't mean any disrespect to anybody when I say that, but I really feel that way, that we're just fooling ourselves. I used to work Lifeway Christian Store, and the culture there is as white as it can be, more so even than this church. And, you know, I've had times where, like on the sales floor of the bookstore, I might be needed to go talk to somebody for whatever reason. And trying to tell me who to go talk to, they might talk about how he's wearing jeans, he's got on a red shirt, you know, he's carrying a briefcase. And I look around and I'd be like, you mean the black guy? And their eyes would get big, like, I can't believe you said that out loud. You know, and because they wanted to just kind of pretend they're looking past it. But that reminds me of another time I waited on a lady there in the bookstore, and I walked up and said, hi, how you doing? And she said, hi, and she gave me her name, and she said, and she, you know, her name is Polly. She said, hi, I'm Polly and I'm black. And I just I was like, what? She said, I'm Polly and I'm black. I said, okay. And I asked her, so why do you introduce yourself that way? And she said, well, as I walk around a store like this, I know that's what is on everybody's mind. And so she said, so I figure when I'm start a conversation with somebody, she said, I just lay it out there. Just get it out there so we can get it behind us. Because I really came in so I could buy a gift for my friend. Can you help me with that? And just interesting experiences.
You know, it's interesting to me because I sit here and I listen to everyone, and to me, what it breaks down to is, I'm sorry. To me, what it breaks down to is a willingness to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Because when you talk about these situations, like Tommy's situation, going into the ghettos or the projects, but being a part of that community, you're going to have African Americans that have their biases of him there from the get-go. But the fact that he's comfortable getting uncomfortable, they start to learn that, hey, he's a nice guy. He's a good person. Maybe this, you know, he's in our community, he's involved in our community. I think when you look at places like Cummins, Georgia as well, you're afraid to go to places like that. But we had this conversation last night. I try to get comfortable being uncomfortable because I'm always in a normalized culture. So for me, I try to stick my chest out. I try to be that person that, hey, get to know me and I think I'll change your mind about your bias. And I think people have to be willing to do that more so than not. But it's tough. I mean, I'm in an interracial marriage, and it's my lovely wife here, Leslie. And I've got a little girl who I worry about every single day. And Leslie and I talk about the hair products. I don't know what to use on her hair because it's part of the normalized culture, it's part of the non-normalized culture. So just little things like that. And I wonder what, because things are learned, these biases are learned, when they're kids, they're just kids. They all play. That whole adage about playing in the sandbox, they just play together. But at some point, they develop a bias. And why is that? Why do we do that to our kids? Why do we do that to each other?
Why do we do it to ourselves?
Right.
I mean, some of my best meals were in non-white households. Right. You miss out. You don't go to Mexico.
Okay, we have like 3 or 4 hands up, so 2, 3. Go ahead.
I mean, a couple of things. One, with the normalized culture, I mean, that can be, I think we've kind of said this already, but there's pockets of that everywhere. White culture, black culture, there's different cultures within religion in and of itself. I've never been raised, I have not been raised in a Catholic church, but me going into a Catholic church, I'm walking into a normalized culture that I don't know. So no matter what, black, white, whatever it is, there's a certain amount of risk that is taken in walking through into a different culture. And so kind of tying back, you know, to looking at things through the eyes of children. And what I think is interesting, you know, when we talk about not seeing color, I would agree with that statement. Sounds kind of ignorant in the fact that who cares, ultimately. And I saw that with my oldest son very recently. I'm taking him to a hockey game, and he's standing there in front of everybody and points out, I know exactly who PK Subban is because he's the only brown-skinned person out there, and I know who he is every single time. And so he gets to cheer for him because he can point that person out, and he knows who that is. Well, at first, I'm like, you know, trying to shut him up, but then I start laughing. I'm like, that's right, because who cares? I don't know where I'm going with all of this, but tying two things together, there's a risk associated with any culture crossing over. There's risk for you going to, you know, a small town in Georgia, and there's a certain amount of risk at some point that I or someone else would take going into getting gas in the project. But at some point, you have to take that risk if you want to do anything about it. Otherwise, I don't get anywhere.
Just a quick comment on this question or this discussion about seeing color or not seeing color. I tend to fall in the camp of not trying to point that out. It's not because I want to see physically everyone as the same. I think for me, it kind of goes back to normalized culture. If you're telling a story, a lot of times people tell stories that they describe the people in the story. If there are people of color in that story, they'll say the black guy or the brown girl or whatever. But if you're telling a story with white people, they just say that guy or this girl. And to me, that's where there's a big difference in that and where the normalized culture comes into it.
I think too, I have an appreciation for what Tom said because, and I have friends in this room who can identify, it's okay until your son or daughter comes home with the girlfriend or boyfriend that's another culture. The black girlfriend or the black boyfriend, and then it gets really, or the white girlfriend or the white boyfriend. And so that's when it gets really different. But I think for all of us, because we had the child who, when she was little, Dr. Light, you remember that she was very high verbal. And we would go into the store and, Mama, what's he in that chair with the wheels? And, I mean, and Mom knows, I used to run, like if I saw somebody who looked a little different, I'm going to try to run and go the other way because I knew that she was going to come out and say something and everybody would understand what she was talking about. And this kind of plays along with culture. I found that we just address it. We just talk about, you know what? You have legs to get around this store, but his don't work all the time, so he gets to ride this motor chair. Oh, Mommy, can I ride with you? And I'm like going, and he said, yeah, sit her down on my lap. I'm thinking, oh, I don't want her sitting on the manny's lap. But, I mean, he was so nice. And, I mean, and she was talking. And he did roll her around the store a little bit on the wheelchair. And I walked beside and kind of held her hand. But, I mean, and that's the way it is. We just have to talk about it because he is in a wheelchair. His legs don't work. And but you also, it's with race as well because I heard a lady, she posted on Facebook, she said, this lady, a friend of hers came up and the little girl said, why didn't her boy match the rest of the family? I mean, and so you have to just talk about it.
It's a legitimate question.
I mean, it is, yes. Okay.
I hear people saying, I heard Tom say a while ago, you know, this is kind of the theme of what we're talking about. Your original question was, what did we think about all week?
Mm-hmm.
What I thought about all week is exactly where I think you're trying to go, which is to say, yeah, I'm a white, male, privileged, in the spiritual context, every bit of that means nothing. I'm a white Christian man, which overshadows all the rest of that stuff. And I gotta admit, Jeannie knows this real well. I'm just naive and stupid. I tend to think that the world looks at us and says, okay, that's a white Christian male. And therefore that helps explain his motivations and the way he talks and what he does. The cultural reality is we are strangers and aliens in this culture, and our job is to overcome. I tell you very briefly, people are telling stories. The thing in the last 5 years that has upset me the most, and it burned me hard, talk about overcoming barriers. Black professional woman at Vanderbilt said something that I just thought was interesting, and I was curious. And I approached her and I said, the alarm bells go off. Do not have this conversation. Only trouble comes from this conversation. The Christian in me says, I'm curious. She's an image bearer. I want to learn from her. Every email from Vanderbilt that comes out about diversity, and I delete them because they're not serious about that. I got burned, and I got burned hard in a professional setting. And the lesson is, in the professional setting, do not, under any circumstances, express that courtesy, try to bridge that gap, because it is not welcome. I got burned hard. The Christian in me says, oh, but that was just her, that was the influence of Satan. The point I want to make very hard is, we walk in a cultural context. I said something to a black woman, a friend of mine, about 3 years ago. She stopped me, she said, do you realize how that sounds to my ears as a black woman? I said, you're right. Never even occurred to me. We have to be very sensitized that we're Christians, aliens, walking in a world that does not understand our values, does not understand who we are at all. So I agree, Tom. Yeah, I'm a white man. I'm a white Christian. And if we're going to see people as image bearers, it means that we try really hard to let that Christian motivation be the predominant. And I struggle with this. I'm sinful in this. I got burned so hard in that professional setting, I'm going to stay in my comfort zone.
I have to work on it.
I'm going to stay in my comfort zone because I got burned bad.
It's hard.
And it hurt.
It's hard.
And it was unfair and it was wrong,
It can't be real.
but that's her perspective.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, and no more. We're gonna be out of time and I need to wrap.
I'm a 70-year-old white male with all the baggage and the culture that goes along with that. And in my work life, I did see color, Hispanic, Asian, black, white, and I did try to treat them with the same respect and with the same opportunity. But you said something a couple of weeks ago that, don't tell me you understand me because I'm black. You don't know my culture and you can't understand it. Intellectually, I agree with it, and intellectually, I understand it. But emotionally, you put me in a box. So if I can't understand it, and never will to the degree that you do, but how do I bridge that gap to improve that and get a better understanding and improve the relationship? Because it kind of turns you off when you hear that. So it makes it more difficult for me, how do I find that way to, otherwise, why would I try? If I'm never going to understand it, why would I even try to get better at it?
So the thing that I struggle with the most is how, with my kids about this, how to just how to talk about it. And my kids are in Metro Public Schools. They're pre-Paul Elementary, which is semi-diverse, but it's not the most diverse. And it's a struggle to me because just like all things with kids, you don't want to squash their innocence. And about a year ago, I made some comment. There was a person on TV, I think it was the owner of the Houston Texans, whose last name was McNair. My son, the huge football fan, was like, maybe that's Steve McNair's grandfather. And I was like, no, Bane, it can't be his grandfather. He's white. And he's like, but Robert's parents are white, and because he's got a friend and like when I go to eat lunch with him, he's got one friend that's from Ethiopia adopted by white parents, one friend from a Sudanese family that's immigrated here, and then one friend from Atlanta. That they're all mind are all his friends and they all brown skin, but like, and I know at some point we need to talk about that. I know he needs to understand that, but it's, I don't know, that's what is my responsibility as a parent to, speak into that, I guess.
You guys are the last two.
I come from the other side. My husband is African American. We've been together for 9 years. And when we first started dating, I thought I was doing the right thing by saying, I don't see color, I don't understand this. And he would start to tell me these stories, and I would see something, because the way he portrayed himself in public is so different than the heart that he had from what he had experienced. And I never truly understood it until I had to go to Virginia to see his family, and I was the minority in that church setting, and I was the only person, and you would never know this is something that is on their mind or in his mind, and works for a prestigious company, socializes, honestly, I will say he leads to one group of friends more than the other, but he has a diverse friendship, and it's interesting being on the other side of it and being what would be considered the privileged person going into it and feeling and understanding a different side. And last week, the only thing I could think of is that we did those cards and there were certain questions that I didn't know how to answer, and somebody said there are 32 blanks to be who you want to be. And that spoke to me, because I no longer wanted him to be the person that he feels he has to be, a public version and a private version, because I know it's a struggle. And I don't want to be the person that is, here's my story, and I'm the, token white girl. I went, grew up here. I did this, I did that. You don't want to be that person. So his mom is one of my best friends, and I called her and I spoke to her and I was like, this is what we're doing in church. This is where I'm struggling. What do you have to say? And the only thing she can say is, you have to put yourself, like Tom said, in those situations. Coming and visiting with the environment and being who you were in that church and in that setting, that's where you have to live every single day. And you have to have that heart on you to know what it's like. And if you don't push yourself to that point and you're not honest about this, and this, you're never going to understand. And not even just the race thing, but honest about the situation of what is going on.
Jacob, last one.
Yeah, I was just a clarifying point. I know there was some questions about normalized culture. So yes, that does kind of the standard culture, and it could vary from community to community. But we talked about risk as well, and taking risks and put yourself out there. So another term maybe that would be helpful is majority culture. So when that normalized culture is widespread all across the nation, and that normalized culture tends to be, so if I think of National Lampoons, right? And so what perspective is that coming from? When I look at a lot of movies, when I look at who the famous actors are, and these people and politicians, right? The normalized culture that is in the majority, that is the standard across the nation, right? So there's more risk involved for people within the multicultural community, right? Than there would be for those of us that are Caucasian, that come from have certain demographic factors in there. So maybe a helpful term as well to know the majority culture, because that's when normalized becomes widespread. So not just in a single community.
So, wow. Thank you for processing for the last 45 minutes. A lot of good information. And I think that it's important that we have this conversation, because this is how we get beyond the box. We have to have the conversation. When you think about privilege, one of the things that privilege does, black privilege, white privilege, whatever privilege you want to fill in that blank with, privilege protects itself, and it denies that it exists. And so the only way that we get beyond this normalization of these cultural moves is we have to say, it is what it is, and how can I use my privilege to make a difference? You've all been in situations where you have notice that people respond to you a certain way? Was it because of your privilege or your lack of privilege? I would imagine you probably experienced both. But there is a majority culture that I would say to you probably experiences it more than the rest of the culture. I remember when a friend of mine said to me, and this friend is not in this room, how should I feel about my daughter dating a black guy? And I mean, and it was just an honest, from the heart question. I don't know, how should you feel? What's different? What are you afraid of? I think oftentimes, it again goes back to that. We're afraid that we are kind of withdrawing elements of privilege from our cultural identity. Because now we're associating with people that we don't typically associate with. People that the majority culture would not hold as privilege. And so how do we deal with that? Paulette and I think she listens and I talk on this one. One of the things that really scares me is all of these Caucasian families adopting black children. It really scares me. And I know you're probably thinking, well, why does that scare him? He should be excited. It scares me. Because I wonder if they are having the conversations that they need to have to help their kids navigate that chasm that's going to exist. Or that I'm not going to say exist, I'm going to back that up. That they're going to experience when that kid gets older and the kid and the parents walk into a room. Privilege is going to make that chasm exist. It's going to be there, whether you want it to be there or not. How are you going to bridge that? This type of conversation is how we begin to bridge it. You can't understand my culture. You can't understand what it's like to be me unless you're willing to be vulnerable, unless we're willing to have questions, unless you're willing to come to my house and invite me to your house. I read a statement once, you can't say you have friends who are people of color if you have never been to their house and they have never been to yours. I read that, so don't throw any rocks at me. I think there's a lot of truth there. It's like, you invite all your other friends over, and maybe I invite you over. So that's another part of this conversation that's important. Once we get beyond the privilege, what does it look like in the everyday? How do we advocate for? How do we support? How do we speak up? How do we step into that space and have that conversation? And I want to go back to John chapter 8. We just kind of skimmed it last Sunday, and I know I'm probably like, oh gosh, I'm 4 minutes over. But go back and read about the woman caught in adultery. Go back and read that. There's a lot of privilege there. Pharisees, there's a lot of privilege. The men, Jesus had privilege. And look at how he responded.
Did you ask about the choir room next week?
We can do that same thing. We have the opportunity to do that same thing. And we should be doing it. Why? Because we're image bearers. And just like Jesus paused and rolled on the ground and then restored that person to a place of dignity, we have the opportunity to do the same thing. But we have to first admit one of the tools that we walk into the conversation with is our privilege. How are we going to use it? Next Sunday, I'm not letting y'all talk next Sunday. Get it all out this week. You're going to be quiet next Sunday.
You should have told him that.
Did you not announce that?
I did, but some people may have come in late.
Next Sunday in the choir room. The choir room is behind the stage. You can't go on top of the stage. You have to go outside and
I'm not
around.
going outside if it's raining. I'm going on top of the stage.
Everybody have a good week.
Lock the door.